The war had already taught its lessons before the children were old enough to understand what a lesson was. Fear arrived early, settling into their bodies with the permanence of hunger or cold. It was not learned through explanation but through repetition. The sound of boots on stone, the sharp change in adult voices, the way doors were forced open and never quite closed the same way again. Childhood did not end in a single moment. It thinned out gradually, replaced by vigilance. Even games, when they happened at all, were quiet and brief, conducted with an awareness that joy itself could attract attention. These children had learned to exist in the margins of destruction. Bombed buildings became shelter, and shattered walls framed a world where danger could arrive from any direction. They slept close together, not for warmth alone but for reassurance, their small bodies forming clusters as if proximity itself might keep the war from noticing them. Silence was survival. Crying was a risk. Curiosity, once natural, had been trained out of them by consequences they did not fully understand but never forgot. Adults had tried to protect them, but adults were frightened too. Reassurance came in fragments, often contradicted by reality moments later. Promises that everything would be fine dissolved under the weight of air raids and sudden disappearances. The children learned not to ask questions whose answers might hurt. They learned to read faces instead, tightened jaws, widened eyes, hurried movements that signaled when it was time to hide. Fear became a shared language, spoken without words. By the time foreign soldiers appeared, terror was no longer an emotion but a condition. The children did not need to be told to huddle together. Their bodies moved instinctively, forming a compact shape designed to be overlooked, ignored, spared. They understood power only as something that acted upon them, never with them. Uniforms meant authority, and authority meant unpredictability at best, violence at worst. There was no room in their experience for benevolence that did not demand something in return. Their memories were crowded with moments that had begun quietly and ended badly. A knock at the door that seemed ordinary until it wasn't. A patrol that passed by without incident one day and returned the next with accusations. Kindness, when it appeared, was fragile and temporary, often followed by loss. The children learned to distrust calm, to brace themselves when things grew quiet, because quiet usually preceded chaos. Waiting became a form of endurance. Waiting for the next order, the next raid, the next absence. It was easier to anticipate anger than to imagine mercy, because anger had patterns they recognized. Mercy did not. Mercy had no rules they could rely on. To hope was to expose oneself, and exposure was dangerous. So they waited in terror not because something was happening, but because something always did. The physical world reinforced these lessons. Streets were scarred with rubble and shell marks, landmarks reduced to jagged outlines of what they used to be. Familiar places no longer felt safe, and unfamiliar ones were worse. Every space carried the residue of violence, even when it appeared still. The children navigated this environment carefully, memorizing which corners offered cover, which buildings echoed too loudly, which routes were least likely to be watched. Their bodies carried the war's imprint. Shoulders hunched forward, eyes trained downward or toward exits, movements economical and restrained. Even standing still required effort, because stillness could draw attention. They learned to make themselves small, to disappear into crowds or shadows. Hunger sharpened their awareness, cold dulled it, but fear was constant, an undercurrent that never fully receded. In this world, emotions were regulated by necessity. There was little room for surprise, and none for innocence. When soldiers were rumored to be nearby, the children felt it before they saw anything. The tension spread through the air, picked up from adults' hurried whispers and the sudden urgency in their actions. The children responded automatically, retreating into the practiced posture of waiting. They waited for shouting. They waited for being told where to stand, what not to do, how not to look. They waited for punishment delivered without explanation, because explanation was a luxury war did not afford. Even before any interaction occurred, the outcome felt predetermined. Fear did not ask what might happen. It assumed the worst and prepared the body accordingly. The act of huddling was both practical and symbolic. Together, they felt less alone, even if they knew that togetherness did not guarantee safety. It was a way of acknowledging vulnerability without speaking it aloud. Their closeness was silent agreement. Whatever comes, we face it side by side. Individuality dissolved in these moments, replaced by a collective instinct to endure. Time behaved differently in such moments. Seconds stretched, filled with anticipation so dense it became exhausting. The children's minds raced through remembered images of past encounters, assembling a future they dreaded but expected. There was no sense of agency, only readiness. Readiness to freeze, to comply, to absorb whatever followed. The war had narrowed their understanding of humanity. People were no longer simply people. They were threats, resources, or burdens. Trust had become selective, rationed carefully like food. Outsiders, especially armed ones, belonged firmly in the category of danger. The children did not question this framework because questioning required energy they did not have. This was the psychological landscape into which the moment unfolded. Long before any British presence became visible, the children were already reacting, their fear activated by the mere possibility of confrontation. The war had conditioned them thoroughly, shaping their expectations with relentless consistency. Violence had been frequent enough to feel normal. Kindness, rare enough to feel unreal. In waiting for anger, the children were not being pessimistic, they were being rational, responding to the evidence their lives had provided. To expect anything else would have felt irresponsible, even foolish. Survival depended on assuming that power would hurt, that authority would demand submission, that encounters would end badly. This was not cowardice but adaptation. The children had learned how to stay alive in a world that offered no guarantees. Their terror was not exaggerated, it was measured, refined by experience. Every muscle, every held breath, reflected a hard-earned understanding of how quickly things could turn. The approach of the British forces was felt long before it was clearly seen. Rumors moved faster than troops, carried through whispers, hurried gestures, and the sudden tightening of adult routines. Windows were covered, doors reinforced, possessions gathered and hidden as if concealment itself might ward off what was coming. To the children, this change in atmosphere was unmistakable. The air grew tense, heavy with anticipation, as though the city were holding its breath. Something was arriving, and whatever it was, it carried power. For the children, all soldiers belonged to the same category of threat. Nationality meant little in a world where uniforms had consistently brought fear. The distinctions that mattered to historians and commanders were irrelevant to those who had only known occupation, requisition, and punishment. A soldier was a soldier, defined by boots that echoed too loudly, weapons that dominated every interaction, and an authority that allowed them to reshape lives without warning. The British advance did not appear as liberation in the minds of the young. It appeared as another chapter in a familiar cycle. They had been taught, not formally but relentlessly, to recognize the signs of impending danger. The sound of engines in the distance, the interruption of daily routines, the sudden absence of adults who had gone to gather information and had not yet returned. These were signals as clear as alarms. The children responded instinctively, retreating from open spaces and gathering close to walls, corners, and one another. The world narrowed again, as it always did when armed men were near. Expectation shaped every reaction. The children had learned that soldiers rarely approached without purpose, and that purpose was rarely benign. They associated advances with demands, for food, for labor, for compliance. Even when violence did not immediately follow, it always felt close, like a shadow that could detach itself at any moment. The British soldiers, unseen but imminent, occupied this same mental space. Hope did not arise because hope had never proven useful. Uniforms, in particular, carried immense symbolic weight. Fabric colors, insignia, and accents blurred together under the pressure of fear. What remained was the shared visual language of dominance. Rifles slung across shoulders, belts heavy with equipment, posture that communicated control of space. The children had learned to read these details not with curiosity but with caution. Every visible marker of authority reinforced the imbalance between those who carried weapons and those who did not. As the soldiers drew nearer, the children's anticipation sharpened into physical sensation. Stomachs tightened, Breaths became shallow, limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. They did not run unless told to. Running could attract attention. Instead, they froze or moved slowly, deliberately, as though careful motion might make them invisible. This was not fear in its dramatic form, but fear refined into discipline. The British presence also activated memories of previous transitions. Other armies had arrived before, sometimes welcomed at first, sometimes feared immediately, but always leaving their mark. Each change in control had promised something different and delivered something familiar. The children remembered how initial calm had given way to new rules, new punishments, new disappearances. Change itself had become synonymous with loss. Adults tried to interpret events, to assess whether this arrival might be different. The children observed these attempts closely, searching faces for signs of reassurance or alarm. But adults were cautious too, their expressions guarded. No one celebrated openly. No one relaxed. This collective restraint communicated a clear message. It was too early to trust, too dangerous to assume. In this environment, waiting became an active state. The children did not simply pass time, they endured it. Every minute felt like a test of patience and nerve. The expectation of anger was not abstract. It was grounded in lived experience, reinforced by stories whispered among the young and half-explained by the old. Anger was predictable. Anger followed rules. Smiles did not. The British soldiers, when they finally appeared, brought with them the full visual impact of military presence. Even at a distance, they commanded attention. Their movement through the streets altered the rhythm of daily life, causing pauses and detours as civilians adjusted their behavior around them. The children watched from places of partial concealment, their curiosity restrained by fear. Observation was safer than engagement. Every detail was noted and interpreted through the lens of survival. How quickly did the soldiers move? Did they shout? Did they point their weapons? These questions mattered more than flags or insignia. The children's assessments were pragmatic, focused entirely on immediate risk. Each unfamiliar gesture was measured against remembered dangers. The expectation of punishment loomed even without provocation. The children had learned that innocence offered no protection. Being young had not spared them before, it had merely changed the form of vulnerability. They had seen children punished for being in the wrong place, for not understanding instructions, for existing at inconvenient moments. Age did not equal safety. It often meant confusion, and confusion could be fatal. As the British soldiers advanced, the children prepared themselves mentally. They rehearsed stillness, silence, compliance. They reminded themselves not to stare, not to speak, not to react unless directly addressed. These internal rules were not taught in schools but absorbed through observation and consequence. Breaking them had always carried a cost. The environment mirrored their internal state. Streets that had once been lively fell quiet. Sounds became sharper, more isolated. Footsteps echoed more distinctly, amplifying the sense of exposure. The children felt as though they were standing on a stage, watched by an unseen audience with absolute power over the outcome. In this moment, fear was not chaotic. It was orderly, almost methodical. The children's bodies aligned with their expectations, bracing for what they believed was inevitable. There was no space for imagining a different ending, because imagination had been punished before. Survival depended on realism, and realism, as they understood it, left no room for benevolence. The British soldiers' proximity intensified this mindset. The children could now see faces, though from a distance. Faces meant individuality, but individuality did not translate into safety. They had seen friendly faces harden quickly in the past. They had learned that expressions could change without warning, and that first impressions were unreliable. What the children anticipated was not a specific act of violence but the emotional tone they had come to associate with authority, anger, impatience, dominance. They expected to be treated as obstacles, nuisances, or resources. They expected to be ignored until they were needed, and punished when they failed to understand what was required of them. This expectation shaped their stillness. They did not cry out or cling to adults. They did not run toward or away from the soldiers. They compressed themselves into the smallest possible presence, attempting to occupy less space in a world that had repeatedly shown them that space could be taken away at any moment. The British advance, then, unfolded not as a dramatic confrontation but as a slow collision between expectation and reality yet to be revealed. For the children, the outcome felt predetermined, written by years of exposure to violence and disappointment. They were not waiting to be surprised, they were waiting to endure. This chapter of the story is defined by that waiting. It captures the psychological momentum of fear, how it gathers force through repetition and memory. The children did not meet the British soldiers as individuals or representatives of a new moral order. They met them as symbols of a system that had never spared them before. The moment that followed did not unfold according to the internal script the children had rehearsed so many times before. Instead of raised voices or abrupt gestures, there was a pause, subtle, almost imperceptible, but heavy with implication. The soldiers slowed. Their posture shifted. What the children saw first was not aggression, but restraint, and this alone was enough to disrupt the logic that fear had carefully constructed over years of survival. The expected surge of authority did not arrive. The world hesitated. Faces became clearer as distance closed, and with that clarity came confusion. Expressions that should have signaled command or impatience instead carried something unfamiliar: softness, curiosity, an absence of threat. The soldiers' mouths curved upward, not in mockery or dominance, but in gestures that, in another life, might have been recognized as warmth. For the children, however, this was not comforting. It was destabilizing. Smiles had not been part of their training. The children did not move. They could not. Their bodies, conditioned to respond to danger, found no instruction for this scenario. Muscles remained tense, locked in anticipation of impact that never came. Breaths were held too long, then released too quickly. The stillness deepened, not as a deliberate choice, but as a failure of comprehension. When violence is expected and does not appear, the absence itself becomes overwhelming. The smiles did not resolve into clarity. They hovered, suspended, demanding interpretation. The children searched them for hidden meanings, for the familiar signs of deception or impending reversal. They had learned that kindness could be strategic, that gentleness might precede betrayal. Every instinct warned them not to trust what they could not explain. The soldiers' restraint felt less like relief and more like a puzzle they did not have the tools to solve. Time stretched again, but differently now. Instead of bracing for impact, the children found themselves trapped in uncertainty. Fear had always offered a grim form of stability. This new ambiguity provided none. The war had taught them how to endure pain, not how to process mercy. Their understanding of power did not include compassion, especially not from those who carried weapons. The soldiers' demeanor remained unchanged. No commands were issued. No weapons were raised. The expected hierarchy of interaction failed to materialize. For the children, this was not a neutral event. It was a rupture. The mental framework that had kept them alive suddenly lacked coherence. If authority did not assert itself through anger, then what rules applied? What dangers were they missing? Some children felt the first stirrings of instinctive withdrawal, a desire to retreat further into themselves, to escape this confusing exposure. Others experienced a kind of internal alarm, sharper than fear, warning them that unpredictability could be more dangerous than cruelty. Violence followed patterns, this did not. Their paralysis deepened, bodies frozen not by threat but by contradiction. The soldiers' smiles, meant as reassurance, functioned instead as mirrors reflecting the depth of the children's trauma. They revealed how thoroughly war had distorted the children's expectations, how deeply suspicion had replaced trust. A gesture intended to humanize instead highlighted the gulf between intention and reception. The children could not meet these expressions halfway. The distance was too great. In that silence, the imbalance of power remained absolute, but its expression was inverted. The soldiers, armed and confident, chose restraint. The children, unarmed and vulnerable, could not choose at all. They were captives of their own conditioning, unable to respond because no response felt safe. The moral reversal was underway, though not yet understood. The absence of immediate harm forced the children to confront memories they had kept buried. They recalled moments when kindness had seemed possible only to be withdrawn. They remembered times when smiles had been followed by orders, when calm had been shattered without warning. These recollections crowded their minds, urging caution, reinforcing stillness. Physically, the children felt exposed. To be seen without being threatened was a strange sensation, one that made them acutely aware of their own visibility. Fear had taught them how to hide. Kindness demanded presence. They did not know how to occupy this space. Their bodies remained curled inward, guarding against a blow that logic insisted must still be coming. The soldiers did not fill the silence with explanation. They did not attempt to bridge the gap verbally. Instead, they waited, allowing the moment to breathe. This patience, too, was unfamiliar. Authority usually demanded immediate compliance. Waiting was a privilege the children had never been afforded. Its presence here only deepened the disorientation. Some children began to notice details they had previously ignored. The way the soldiers' weapons remained pointed downward. The relaxed placement of their hands. The absence of tension in their shoulders. These observations arrived slowly, filtered through layers of doubt. Each detail chipped away at expectation, but none were enough to overturn it completely. Emotionally, the children experienced a collision of impulses. Fear remained dominant, but confusion crept in alongside it, followed by a faint, dangerous curiosity. Curiosity had once been natural, but war had taught them to suppress it. Now it resurfaced, tentative and fragile, unsure whether it was allowed to exist. The smiles continued, steady and unforced. They did not demand acknowledgement. They did not escalate into insistence. This consistency was significant, though the children could not yet articulate why. Consistency had been rare in their lives, especially from those in power. It suggested deliberateness rather than impulse, choice rather than habit. Still, the children froze. Movement felt like a commitment they were not ready to make. To move might be to invite attention. To respond might be to misinterpret. Inaction felt safer, even as it prolonged discomfort. Their stillness was not defiance but self-preservation, a way of delaying decision until certainty emerged. The soldiers' presence, stripped of immediate threat, became an emotional test the children had not prepared for. It forced them to confront the possibility that their understanding of the world might be incomplete. This realization was unsettling. Fear, for all its pain, had offered clarity. The suggestion of mercy introduced complexity, and complexity required trust. Trust, however, was the one resource the war had exhausted. The children had learned to ration it carefully, if at all. In this moment, they had none to spare. Their freeze was an honest reflection of that scarcity. It was not rejection of kindness, but inability to receive it. This chapter unfolds in the space between expectation and reality. It is defined by the children's paralysis in the face of gentleness, by the emotional vertigo that accompanies an unanticipated moral reversal. Violence had shaped their responses. Mercy left them without footing. The smiles did not thaw them. They immobilized them. They exposed the depth of the wound war had inflicted, not on bodies, but on belief itself. In that suspended moment, the children stood at the edge of a new understanding, unable to step forward, yet no longer able to retreat into the certainty of fear. The stillness that followed was not empty, it was crowded with consequences. In the absence of shouted orders or sudden violence, something deeper began to surface, something that had been buried beneath years of constant threat. The children remained frozen, but the reason for their immobility was no longer purely fear. It was exposure. The war had trained them to expect harm, and that expectation had become a kind of armor. Now, confronted with restraint instead of cruelty, that armor felt unnecessary, and without it, they felt unprotected in a new and unsettling way. This moment revealed how thoroughly war had reshaped their inner world. Fear had once been a response. Over time, it had become structure. It organized their thoughts, dictated their movements, and set the limits of their imagination. The children knew how to survive inside fear. They did not know how to exist without it. The absence of aggression stripped away the familiar framework that told them how to behave, leaving them uncertain and vulnerable in a way they had not anticipated. What the soldiers' restraint exposed was not just confusion, but damage. The children's inability to respond to kindness was not ingratitude or defiance. It was evidence of a system of survival that had required emotional suppression. Compassion, when it appeared in the past, had often been conditional or temporary. It had not been safe to rely on it. As a result, the children had learned to close themselves off from it entirely, to treat it as a trap rather than a gift. The longer the moment lasted, the clearer this became. Some children felt an ache they could not name, a tension that was different from fear but just as intense. It was the discomfort of having their expectations challenged. To accept that these soldiers might not hurt them would mean acknowledging how much pain they had already accepted as normal. It would mean admitting that what they had endured was not inevitable, not universal, but imposed. That realization was too heavy to carry all at once. The imbalance of power remained undeniable. The soldiers still controlled the space. They could still choose violence if they wished. But by not exercising that power, they introduced a moral contrast the children were not equipped to process. Authority had always been synonymous with force. Here, authority was expressed through restraint. This inversion unsettled the children more deeply than overt aggression ever had, because it challenged the moral logic they had built their survival upon. In the past, cruelty had at least been comprehensible. It fit the narrative the children had constructed to make sense of their suffering. The world was dangerous, power was abusive, and safety was temporary. Kindness disrupted that narrative. It suggested that cruelty was not the only option available to those in control. This implication carried an unspoken accusation, one that pointed backward at everything the children had lost. As they stood there, motionless, the children were not only responding to the present moment but reliving countless past ones. Memories surfaced uninvited. Soldiers who had laughed before striking, officers who had offered sweets before issuing orders, brief moments of calm that had ended in chaos. These memories reinforced their paralysis. If kindness could turn without warning, then stillness was the safest response. Doing nothing felt like the only way to avoid making a fatal mistake. Yet the soldiers did not turn. Their patience persisted. The absence of escalation began to take on its own weight. Time passed without punishment. This alone was extraordinary. For the children, time had rarely been neutral. It had either carried danger toward them or taken something away. To experience time without consequence, even briefly, was profoundly disorienting. The children's bodies bore the cost of this confusion. Muscles remained clenched, jaws tight, shoulders raised in defensive posture. The effort of holding themselves together was exhausting, but release felt impossible. Relaxation would require trust, and trust felt reckless. The war had punished trust too many times before. This moment also revealed the limits of resilience. The children had survived by adapting to violence, but that adaptation came at a price. It had narrowed their emotional range, compressing it around fear and endurance. When something fell outside that range, they had no practiced response. Their freeze was not weakness. It was the edge of what their coping mechanisms could accommodate. The soldiers' behavior illuminated this truth without intention. By simply not harming, they exposed how much harm had already been done. The children's reaction was a silent testimony to the cumulative effect of occupation, displacement, and loss. Their stillness spoke of nights spent listening for footsteps, of days shaped by obedience, of a childhood spent anticipating pain. The environment itself seemed to pause with them. The usual background noises of a damaged city faded into insignificance. The focus narrowed to this fragile equilibrium, held together by restraint on one side and endurance on the other. It was a moment balanced on the brink of transformation, though no one present could yet see where it would lead. For the soldiers, this may have felt like a small, humane choice. For the children, it was an emotional reckoning. It forced them to confront the possibility that the world was not uniformly cruel, that some harm might have been avoidable. This possibility carried both hope and grief. Hope, because it hinted at a future less defined by fear. Grief, because it underscored the injustice of the past. Accepting kindness would require the children to reopen parts of themselves they had sealed off for survival. It would require vulnerability, a risk they had learned to avoid. Their hesitation was not a rejection of mercy but a reflection of how dangerous vulnerability had become in their lives. War had taught them that exposure led to loss. The moral weight of the moment lay not in dramatic action but in quiet contrast. The soldiers' restraint did not erase the power imbalance, but it redefined its expression. Power could choose not to harm. This idea, simple in theory, was radical in the children's lived experience. It destabilized their understanding of authority and, by extension, their understanding of the world. As the seconds continued to pass, something subtle began to shift beneath the surface of the children's fear. It was not trust, not yet, but a crack in certainty. The certainty that anger was inevitable began to weaken. In its place emerged a fragile uncertainty, less painful than fear but far more complex. Time did not break the tension all at once. It loosened it unevenly, like a knot worked open strand by strand, never fully undone but no longer pulled tight enough to cut. The first changes were almost invisible. A shift of weight from one foot to another. A breath taken more deeply than before. A child's shoulders lowering by a fraction, then lifting again as if uncertain whether the movement had been permitted. The moment did not resolve, it softened. Some children began to test the space around them in the smallest ways possible. Eyes lifted briefly, then dropped again. Hands unclenched, only to curl back inward at the slightest sound. These movements were not conscious decisions but cautious experiments, probes sent out to measure whether the rules of the world had changed or merely paused. Each motion carried risk, and so each was quickly retracted, leaving behind only the faintest trace of willingness. Others did not move at all. Their stillness deepened, becoming more rigid rather than less. For them, the absence of harm was not reassurance but delay. They had lived through enough false calms to know that violence could arrive late, that patience could be strategic. Remaining frozen felt like vigilance, not fear, a way of staying ready, of refusing to be surprised. To move too soon would be to tempt fate. The children were no longer reacting as a single group. The shared posture of terror began to fracture into individual responses shaped by personal memory. Those who had endured the most abrupt cruelty remained locked in place, their bodies unwilling to release what they had learned. Those whose losses had come more gradually, or who had once known gentler authority before the war erased it, found themselves more able to imagine that this moment might be different. The war had not affected them all equally, and now that difference surfaced. The soldiers did nothing to accelerate the process. They did not call out encouragement or attempt to direct behavior. Their restraint extended beyond the initial moment, settling into a quiet presence that neither demanded nor withdrew. This consistency mattered, though its effect was slow. The children were watching not for gestures of kindness, but for signs of reversal. They were waiting to see if patience would turn into irritation, if smiles would harden, if the familiar pattern would reassert itself. As minutes passed without incident, the space itself seemed to change. It became less charged, less brittle. The children could feel it, though they did not yet trust it. Sound returned gradually, the scuff of a boot against stone, a distant voice, the rustle of fabric. None of these sounds triggered immediate fear. This alone marked a shift. Fear had once responded to everything. A few children dared to straighten slightly, their spines uncurving as if releasing a long-held breath. The sensation was unfamiliar and uncomfortable, like stretching a limb that had been kept still for too long. Relief did not arrive cleanly. It was mixed with anxiety, guilt, and disbelief. To relax felt almost like betrayal, of those who had been hurt before, of the lessons survival had taught them. The idea that authority could exist without cruelty began to form, not as a belief but as a question. It hovered at the edges of thought, tentative and fragile. Could this be real? Could power choose restraint and sustain it? The children did not answer these questions. They simply allowed them to exist, cautiously, without committing to them. Some children noticed details they had ignored earlier. The soldiers' faces, no longer scanned solely for threat, appeared tired rather than menacing. Their movements were unhurried, deliberate. There was no sense of urgency, no preparation for enforcement. These observations accumulated slowly, building a case that contradicted fear but did not yet overturn it. Others remained inwardly focused, consumed by the effort of holding themselves together. For them, the emotional cost of engagement was too high. The possibility of disappointment loomed larger than the possibility of safety. They had learned that hope, once awakened, hurt more deeply when crushed. Better to remain guarded than to reopen wounds that had barely scarred over. This uneven response created a quiet tension among the children themselves. Those who began to move felt exposed, visible not only to the soldiers but to their peers. Movement risked judgment, as if it implied trust where trust had not been collectively agreed upon. Stillness, too, carried weight, signaling endurance and caution. No one spoke, but the differences were felt. The soldiers' continued patience allowed these dynamics to unfold without pressure. By refusing to hurry the moment, they created space for the children to respond at their own pace. This, too, was unfamiliar. The children were accustomed to being rushed, ordered, forced into compliance. Choice, even limited choice, was a strange and heavy gift. Gradually, the meaning of the encounter began to shift. What had started as a confrontation defined by expectation of anger became something quieter and more complex. It was no longer about what the soldiers might do, but about what the children were capable of believing. The challenge was internal now. The war had conditioned them to survive violence, not to recognize mercy. For some, the first spark of trust appeared not as comfort but as exhaustion. The effort of remaining frozen became unsustainable. Muscles ached, breath came unevenly, and the cost of vigilance outweighed the perceived risk of relaxation. Letting go was not an act of faith, it was an act of necessity. Even then, it was partial and temporary. The children who softened first did not suddenly feel safe. Safety remained abstract, distant. What they felt was something smaller and more fragile, the absence of immediate danger. This distinction mattered. They were not embracing a new reality, they were acknowledging a pause in the old one. That pause, however brief, allowed something to breathe. As the moment stretched on, it began to inscribe itself into memory. This was no longer just an event, it was becoming a reference point. The children would remember that there had been a time when armed authority did not strike, did not shout, did not demand. Even if the world reverted later, this memory would persist, complicating the narrative fear had built. Not all memories heal. Some simply disrupt. This encounter did not undo trauma, but it fractured its certainty. The children could no longer say with absolute confidence that power always harmed, that uniforms always meant pain. The fracture was small, but it mattered. It introduced doubt into fear's logic, and doubt weakened fear's grip. For the soldiers, the moment may have felt unremarkable, a brief interaction in a long campaign. For the children, it was transformative in a quieter way. It did not change their circumstances overnight, but it altered the boundaries of what they believed possible. That alteration was subtle, almost invisible, but deeply significant. As the tension continued to ease, the children's bodies began to mirror the shift. Postures changed incrementally. Hands rested at their sides instead of clutching at fabric. Heads lifted just enough to take in more of the world. These were not gestures of confidence, but of cautious re-entry into presence. The war was still there. The danger had not vanished. But something had been added to the children's internal landscape, the knowledge that restraint could exist where cruelty was expected. This knowledge did not replace fear, but it complicated it, layering it with uncertainty and possibility. What remained after the soldiers moved on was not relief in any simple sense, but residue. The encounter did not conclude cleanly, as stories often do. It lingered, settling unevenly into memory, reshaping itself as time passed. The children did not immediately understand what had happened, only that something had failed to happen, and that this absence mattered. Long after the space emptied and the sounds of boots faded into distance, the moment continued to exist inside them, quietly altering the way they remembered the world. At first, the memory surfaced as confusion. When the children replayed it in their minds, they searched for the part they must have missed, the hidden threat, the delayed punishment, the reason fear had not been justified. They expected the story to resolve itself later, to reveal that their instincts had been right all along. But no such resolution came. The encounter remained incomplete, resistant to the patterns they were used to applying. This unsettled them. War had taught them that events always made sense in retrospect, even if the sense was cruel. Violence followed logic. Loss followed exposure. Mistakes explained suffering. This memory refused to cooperate. It offered no lesson in obedience, no reinforcement of caution. Instead, it introduced a question mark where certainty used to be.